So now we will go to the question about the with the discussants. So I would like to invite Professor Beverly Silver to talk for 15 minutes. So Professor Silver is professor in the Department of Sociology and director of the Ariki Center for Global Studies. Her research focuses on problems of development, labor, social conflict, and war using comparative and world historical methods of analysis. By recasting these issues in a broad geographical and long-term historical framework, her work teases out patterns of recurrence, evolution, and true novelty in contemporary processes of globalization. So, over to you, Professor Silver.
Okay. Thank you very much. I just wanted to start by saying how grateful I am for the opportunity to participate in this South-South Forum, and thanks to the organizers and particularly Lau Kinchi. It's really important to be able to see old friends, new friends, and deepen these conversations in this time when it's really difficult to get together in person. And as a lot of people have pointed out, it's not simply the question of the pandemic, but already a year ago, we had a long arrangement that we had set up to have a conference in Baltimore where we would invite people from the new rural reconstruction movement in China, and Professor Wen was supposed to come, as well as other of his colleagues from the new rural reconstruction movement. And we determined that the state of the US-China Cold War was such that it was not wise for Professor Wen to come himself. So I'm extremely pleased for these chances to continue conversations and deepen conversations, even in this moment of great difficulty from many points of view. The presentations were both very rich, and I'm just going to make a few comments. Some of them were things that I had already written down based on reading their written presentations, but they added a lot more things in the oral presentation today. So first, I just wanted to return to a couple of things that were said in the opening session, just to frame the historical period we're in right now. And Gramsci's concept of the interregnum was referred to, whereby the old is dying, the new cannot be born, and a great many morbid symptoms appear. So that's one important way to grasp the moment, the senility of the existing regime and the problems presented by that, of this senile power, in this case, primarily the United States, but the West more generally, and Samir's question of the implosion of capitalism. So it's a period of deep structural crisis of historical capitalism, and a period in which there's that we're already falling into, or we've already fallen into a period of global systemic chaos and deep human suffering. 25 years ago in the 1990s, I was involved in a collective research project comparing world hegemonies and transitions in world hegemonies since the 16th century. And Giovanni Arrighi was leading this project, and the conclusions were presented in a book called Chaos and Governance in the Modern World System, which was published in 1999. But it's interesting because in the conclusions we say that, this is again published in 1999, the two preconditions to avoid a long period of systemic chaos and deep human suffering, because we were already predicting that we were in a period of decline, crisis and decline of US world hegemony, and of a particular form of capitalism in the 20th century, that there were two preconditions. One was a graceful decline of the United States and West more generally, and an adjustment to a more equal power relations in the world. So that was one precondition. And the second precondition was that rising powers, especially in East Asia, and then later especially China, would chart some new path away from the unsustainable and destructive forms of Western capitalism, or from historical capitalism as we have known it historically. And I think Professor Hudson has, for a good chunk of his discussion was about this resistance to a graceful decline. Unfortunately, the decline hasn't been anything but graceful or adjusting to a more equal power relation. It's been one of resisting at every turn in different forms. And I think that, again, both Professor Wen and Professor Hudson hinted at different stages of this resistance. And I'm always like listening to Professor Wen because he gives me more optimism about this possibility of the emergence of alternative paths away from Western capitalism into more sustainable and peaceful modes of interaction. And so I'll return to that too. So I don't have time, but I have, I could go through a number of different phases, but I think they were also, in terms of this resistance, US resistance to decline, let me say that I think one thing holds it together. There is a question of interests, but there's also, I think, a cultural problem which is difficult to overcome, and that is there's a broad attachment in the United States to this idea of being number one, or being the indispensable country, or being, special, the best country on earth, the greatest country on earth. And this is like, it's not, there's a broad attachment to it. It's not a universal attachment, but a very broad attachment to it. And then so that opens up the capacity to mobilize support for policies which are actually, in the end, destructive for the United States, for the people of the United States, and certainly destructive for the people of the world. And so I think that that's one difficult area that, is incumbent on movements and people and intellectuals and activists in the United States to try and work against. I had down to go into, 2001, 2003, Professor Wen Tiejun referred to the Obama pivot back to East Asia, and then this new Trump era. I think, let me just take a minute to raise some questions about the current peculiarity of this attachment, because up until there was a heavy, up until Trump comes in, there's a heavy rhetorical and actual emphasis on the threat to go to war. I think Trump certainly doesn't eliminate it, and there's still incredible amount of use of military force. But one thing that comes to the fore, and again, it may not be new, and it certainly isn't new, but it's this bullying over the access to the US market, which, again, in Professor Wen's comments, the new policy is, Chinese policy is about trying to actually not to fall victim to that bullying, that, to rely on other markets, and the access to the US banking system. And so I think that in some of the written things that were distributed, There was, and particularly from Professor HUDSON, there was the discussion of the importance of de-dollarizing the the global economy, and to find alternatives to the US banking system to eliminate this capacity to bully based on the economic and financial system to force, to kind of assert power and dominance. And, you know, and then of course there's the military, there's still the military question. Of course, everybody, including many people in the United States, understand that the US military has not been is capable of great destruction, but is not capable of being used as a tool for actually governing or even dominating. It's a tool that is potentially a great source of chaos in the world. So in that sense, again, getting back to the global and the US kind of mobilization movement side, it's, you know, right now there's a lot of discussion about defunding the police in terms of, as one of the things that's coming up in the Black Lives Matter protests, but more generally defunding the military as something that's not, you know, that's not healthy for the United States, not healthy for the world. So I guess, you know, this question of how the dollar, on the one hand, you know, this kind of almost mystery of how the dollar has managed to retain its predominance despite the, you know, despite this massive debts, which are only going to get worse. And so eventually we may, I think, in looking forward or being proactive, you know, I think what, you know, eventually the dollar will collapse. You know, what is going to be the US state and society reaction to the collapse of this pillar of its power in the world? And it's a concern. And I pose that as a question about how, you know, how we navigate that moment. The second precondition for avoiding a long period of systemic chaos was the emergence of alternatives to Western capitalism. You know, as Giovanni Arrighi and Adam Smith in Beijing argued that China was fundamentally the bearer of a different historical model of development, that there were potentially routes for more ecologically sustainable, livelihood-oriented material expansion. And I think that that's, again, a question of pushing along those alternatives as opposed to this absorption of the neoliberal ideology. But again, it seems that no matter what the choice, China maybe doesn't have the luxury of following neoliberalism, and so that may be a good thing for the world as a whole. The last, I'm just going to take my last minute here to raise a question about protagonists. Who are the protagonists of alternatives? And to some extent, you know, there was a comment again in the opening session yesterday about moving to a post-Westphalian world, you know, a world where states as actors were less critical. And so I don't know what kind of hybrid situation between states as important actors in developing alternatives and other actors as important. Certainly, there's the role of social movements historically has been huge in all progressive transitions or transformations of capitalism before and after. And one interesting thing is that before the, even before COVID, you know, before the pandemic became the thing that was going to define 2019, it was actually everybody in the press was talking about 2019 as the year of global social protest. It was a year of massive protest globally. And in fact, the second decade of the 21st century was a decade of massive global social protest. And then COVID came, and now actually within a few months, we're also back to something that's clearly a period of mass global social protest, which is, again, a sign of deep crisis of social legitimacy for capitalism. So my last sentence is, again, referring back to things that were said yesterday, well, actually things that were said today about prioritizing livelihoods. I take the question of material expansion. I'm not sure about the term industrial capitalism, but the material expansion or productive expansion as prioritizing livelihoods and life over profits. And in particular, this question of the right to breathe in different forms that was raised yesterday and is being raised and understood broadly as people embrace this Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm out of time, but I said there's an incredible amount of things to discuss that I would, hope we have lots of chances.
Yes, thank you, Professor Silva. Surely we will have, well, we are starting the dialogue now, and then I think we will follow up with more discussions. So, well, thank you very much. So now I would like to invite Professor Remy HERRERA from the University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne in France. He is economist and researcher at the National Center for Scientific Research, and he is the co-author of The Struggle for Food Sovereignty and one of the coordinators of the World Forum of Alternatives. And he works regularly with the Center Europe Tiejun, Geneva, supporting it in its advisory role to the Council of the United Nations Human Rights. So, Remy, please.
Many thanks, Yinshi, to you and to all the team, the dream team you have with you in the Lingnan University. And hello, everybody. Many friends on the mosaic. Well, I will make basically three short series of comments. First, personally, I think that current capitalism, which is right now controlled by giant financial oligopolies with huge powers far superior to any state, any capitalist state, even the US state. This current capitalism has today become mainly destructive of economies for sure, but destructive of societies taken as a whole, of individuals, and even of the environment. So it is becoming a threat to humanity and even to life on Earth. But at the same time, this capitalism is locked up, is trapped in a systemic crisis. I mean, it can no longer find solution to its problems by using the mechanism of its own logic. For example, substituting workers by machines tends to undermine the base that creates value, and at the same time accumulating capital, especially in the forms of fictitious capital, private shares, derivatives, but also, and right now, above all, public debt, makes believe that capital could do without workers to create value. And for sure, this is an illusion. In reality, the entire system under US hegemony is stuck in a spiral of capitalist crisis and at the same time of imperialist wars. It is true that capitalism has experienced many other crises in the past, and that it has overcome them all, thanks to the states, thanks to central banks, etc. But I believe that it has reached such deep contradiction that we have to consider seriously the possibility of its implosion, as Samir Amin suggested. This implosion can only come from the accentuation of this internal contradiction and simultaneously from the widening of anti-systemic struggles, popular struggles, and even more the convergence of popular struggles from the north as well as from the south, the global south. The current episode of the coronavirus has, of course, further aggravated this systemic crisis by affecting globalization, that is to say, by affecting the space of deployment of the capital cycle, hence the current and the economic depression with a worsening of exploitation or unemployment, low wages, destruction of social and civic rights, and so on. And additionally, the environmental crisis is giving a dramatic and urgent turn to the demand for change. Second point, the United States has launched for 2.5 years a trade war against China with partly the same methods used in the past to bend Japan under in the 80s under Ronald Reagan. But China is not Japan nor Germany. China, there is no U.S. military base on China's territory, and this is absolutely fundamental. But from a theoretical point of view, a trade war has almost the same effect as a trade crisis. That is to say that it provokes, in the first time, a devaluation of capital. Thus, after that, a recovery of the profit rates of the country that decided to launch, to start the trade war. With a significant difference, however, it is organized by the state itself, and it even brings in some tax revenue to the state, which appeals President Tuen currently. So, to a certain, at the same time, to a certain extent, this current trade war against China is also launched against globalized U.S. transnationals themselves, implemented in China, in IT, in telecoms, in other technologies, for example. And these transnationals, Trump says he wants to relocate, to bring back on the US soil. So we have to consider also the importance of the conflicts between the ruling states, the ruling classes themselves, which could even be considered to be more visible than the classical class struggle with the dominated and ruling classes. Okay, right now, most important is the contradiction between the ruling classes themselves, nationally and internationally. And why that? Perhaps because unequal exchange operating in favor of the United States and against China for some decades tends to diminish over time. That is to say that perhaps because the disadvantage observed against China vis-à-vis the United States is gradually disappearing. Okay, there are unequal exchange between the two countries, but it seems that this unequal exchange is disappearing little by little, and this reveals for sure the relative decline in the hegemonic position of the United States. Hence, this is a suggestion, this trade war. But we also know that the problem is much broader with and Professor Wen insisted on that, with an articulation between this trade war and a currency war launched by the US dollar for years. And even also an articulation of this new Cold War we are talking about on a military dimension, implying serious risk of military war. I mean, it's not mechanical for sure, but this is not, this scenario of military war is not a scenario that the US hopes exclude. Third point and final point, among the options for exit from the crisis envisaged by the dominant fraction of capital, there is, of course, today, that of a generalization of the project of military war destruction linked with the systemic crisis. The current capitalist crisis is a crisis of overaccumulation, especially in the form of fictitious capital bubbles. And overaccumulation is a chronic disease of capitalism from which it cannot escape and which ultimately indicates its structural tendency in the long run to go into crisis and even to go into decay, and to avoid overaccumulation, or to try to avoid the overaccumulation, there exists a solution between inverted commas from the point of view of the capitalist, a drastic solution which is for sure dramatic for the peoples. This solution, let's say solution, this capitalist solution is devaluation of capital by its massive destruction in military wars, even if such wars can worsen the internal contradiction of capitalism. Third, to my mind, the very first alternative is to stop the US regulation, let's say, regulation of the world system by wars, by imperialist wars. The alternative, thus, is to disconnect the infernal machine of wars operated by the giant financial oligopolies, and how to do that? By imposing a democratic control on them, by imposing, I mean imposing, because it will be very strong to do that, but it will be by the reinforcement of the popular struggles. It can be done by imposing a popular control on these financial oligopolies, and for sure on some other strategic sectors they own, they possess. This in order to regain the room of maneuver necessary for national sovereignty and for social progress. For sure, there are many other alternatives, let's say alternatives, okay? But I believe that the Keynesian solution, the solution of Keynesian policies in order to save capitalism through public spending is right now impossible, alas. Since the financial oligopolies right now, which dominate the economies and the states are unwilling to make any compromise, any concession. There is the solution of degrowth. The degrowth thesis contains many good ideas for sure. Less waste, less consumerism, sustainable development, and so on. But I believe it misses the main point. And the main point is that the enemy of humanity is not economic growth. The enemy of humanity has a name, and this name is capitalism, the capitalist accumulation. The same occurs for ecology. Ecology is it's the fundamental way, for sure. It's the main way. But environmentalists have to understand before it's too late that the mortal danger for life is not mankind, but capitalism. And to all these friends, we have to say that a reformed capitalism is not possible. A capitalism with a human face is not possible. Right now, the spiral of crises and wars is destroying any perspective of this kind. So capitalism must be overcome, must be surpassed, must be replaced by a system of generalized social justice, both nationally and internationally. And finally, I conclude by saying that the main alternative for workers and people around the world is and remains socialist transition.
Thank you, Professor Herrera. So now I would like to invite Professor Paulo Nakatani to speak. Professor Nakatani is professor at the Department of Economics and at the postgraduate program in social policy at the Federal University of Espírito Santo in Brazil. He is the former president of the Brazilian Society of Political Economy, member of the Latin American Society of Political Economy and Critical Thinking, and International Observatory of the Crises, and of Global University for Sustainability.
Entonces, lo que quería decir, estamos en un momento distinto que Samira me llamó de un estadio de senilidad del capitalismo.
We are at a moment that Renmin called the senility of capitalism.
Donde las fuerzas destructivas están más fuertes que las fuerzas creadoras.
Where some forces are greater than the forces of creation.
En este momento, el capitalismo está en crisis, no solo económica, pero política, social, del medio ambiente.
This is a moment where capitalism is in crisis, not just economically, but also politically and in relation to the environment.
Que amenaza hasta mismo la humanidad.
Including as an essential threat to humanity.
Bueno, entonces, esta nueva Guerra Fría también es distinta de la de la que existió entre Estados Unidos y la Unión Soviética.
This new Cold War is different than the Cold War that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union.
En aquel momento, los Estados Unidos estaban también en crecimiento, en progreso, y la Unión Soviética salió de la Segunda Guerra Mundial muy destruida y más enfraquecida. Entonces,
At that moment in that prior Cold War, the United States, post Second World War, was in a period of growth, and the Soviet Union was confronting a series of challenges.
En aquel momento también el mundo estaba dividido entre lo que llamábamos primer, segundo y tercer mundo. Y
The world was divided into what we might have called the first, the second, and the third worlds.
y el desarrollo del capital era distinto de lo que es hoy en día.
And the development of capital was different than what it is today.
Today, hoy día, en este confronto entre Estados Unidos y China, las más grandes corporaciones americanas en tecnología industrial, tecnología de la información, en servicios, están también.
The confrontation today between China and the United States is different, between some of the largest US conglomerates of industrial technology and other forms of technology.
También actuando en China. Esto crea una cadena productiva de flujos financieros internacionales entre el occidente y China y también en otros países de Oriente.
This creates an international system, international production chain between between the West and between China and other economies in the eastern part of the world.
Pero yo quería marcar que la economía mundial se formó históricamente.
I wanted to mention
con la creación
the world economy is
con la creación de estados nacionales,
the creation of nation states,
en un sistema estructurado e hierarquizado.
it's a system structured upon this.
Adonde el dominio de la economía mundial por Inglaterra hasta principios del siglo XX fue reemplazado por los Estados Unidos después de las dos grandes guerras.
The domination of the British Empire was displaced by the United States coming into the 20th century.
Entonces, el avance de esta nueva Guerra Fría es muy distinta de la antigua, porque con este sistema,
The Cold War is very different than the previous Cold War.
con este sistema estructurado y hierarquizado, se crea también una cadena productiva internacionalizada, adonde
There's an international production chain related and linked to the U.S. economy.
Adonde la China hoy fornece muchos productos, sean materias primas, sean equipos industriales, no solo para
as well as an international production chain related to the Chinese economy.
Ahora yo
as
pienso
well
que,
as a host of other products.
que la situación actual no es solo la disputa entre el dominio de la economía mundial por Estados Unidos y China.
The current dispute between the United States and China is over the dominion of the global economy.
Lo que se coloca para nosotros es la superación del capitalismo.
For us, the question is raised about the possibilities of the superation, the transcending capitalism.
Pero esta superación no va a se dar de un momento para otro en todos los países, porque cada uno de ellos tiene su historia, su proceso civilizatorio, que pasó por un periodo colonial o no pasó.
Each country evaluates what this geopolitical confrontation. Some have colonial legacies and some don't, but this is a process of evaluation for each and every country in the world.
Esta nueva Guerra Fría se da en un contexto a donde tenemos, además de China, tenemos otros países como Cuba, Vietnam, Corea, que están procurando avanzar sus alternativas de transición al socialismo.
So we see not just China, but Cuba, Korea, Vietnam, looking at the possibilities of transitioning beyond capitalism.
Cada uno de ellos con proyectos distintos, porque son realidades distintas.
Each with their own reality and each with a different project based upon that reality.
Y además, estos países que están en transición al socialismo, hay otros que pasan por un bloqueo e intervenciones como Irán, Irak y otros países por la parte de Estados Unidos y de sus aliados más próximos.
There are others, such as Iran and Iraq, who are confronting the United States and their allies in this transition to socialism.
Entonces, esta nueva Guerra Fría, creo que es un momento de que los distintos países tengan un avance en la lucha de clases, en su lucha de clases, para intentar avanzar los cambios. Pero la lucha de clases también aparece de forma distinta en cada estado nacional, cada país.
So this confrontation, this new Cold War, provides a scenario where the class-based struggle in each country takes on new meaning. Of course, recognizing that in each country, the class struggle has different connotations.
Esto significa que hay países donde esta lucha está más avanzada, en otros menos, pero también hay tareas comunes.
In some it's less.
Comunes que está puesta como una necesidad hoy, como esta tendencia a la destrucción de la naturaleza, de los recursos naturales y hasta la posibilidad mismo de la destrucción de la humanidad. Ahora, el desarrollo de la lucha de clases hoy,
the continuation of the human existence, the continuation of class struggle.
en particular en este primer semestre de este año, están poniendo de forma más clara, digamos, fuerzas de la extrema derecha que no estaban colocadas hace algunos años antes.
So this first half of this year, it becomes clear some of the interests that the extreme right is putting forward.
Al mismo tiempo, después de lo ocurrido en Estados Unidos, la lucha de clase pareció como si fuera una lucha entre de razas, ¿no? Pero no podemos pensar solo en la discriminación racial. Esta discriminación tiene que llegar hasta a los movimientos.
Obviously, we need to.
Entonces, yo creo que esta nueva Guerra Fría, sí,
Yes, this is a new Cold War.
tiene diferencias y límites. Los
It
principales
has different limits.
son las cadenas productivas que no había en la época de la antigua Guerra Fría con la Unión Soviética.
International production chains are quite different than what they were for the first Cold War.
Los flujos de capitales que no eran tan grandes, tan generalizados como hoy día.
Capital fluctuation was not as generalized or as immense as it is today.
Por otro lado, tenemos que los Estados Unidos están en decadencia,
We
pero
also see the
mantiene,
United States in decline.
pero mantiene fuerza con instituciones, dominando instituciones multilaterales como el Banco Mundial y el Fondo
At the
Monetario.
same time, we see that it still has a tremendous show of four institutions
Y
and multilateral institutions.
continúa teniendo el dólar como el dinero mundial.
Continues to have the dollar as the global currency
Desde el acuerdo de Bretton Woods.
since the Bretton Woods Accord.
Entonces, a nivel internacional, hay también que intentar superar el dólar como dinero mundial, pero
Internationally, we need to look at ways to get beyond the dollar as the generally accepted global currency.
y está también en curso digamos, todos los estudios, preparaciones para nuevas formas de moneda y para
We're
permitir
So studying around the world different ways of using new forms of money, different monies, different currencies.
para permitir también el movimiento internacional de los capitales.
To find ways to re-understand the international movement of capital.
Bueno, entonces, para mí yo creo que estamos en un momento de cambio internacional. Pero no
For
sabemos,
me, I think we're coming to a point of significant international changes.
pero no sabemos a dónde estos cambios van a nos llevar en el futuro.
At the same time, we don't know where these changes will take us into the future.
Pero para mí es necesario que las fuerzas progresistas se preparen y avancen las luchas de clases en los distintos países para avanzar la transformación
For me,
y avanzar procesos de transición al socialismo.
For me, it's essential that progressive forces in countries around the world continue advancing in this class struggle to be able to visualize this future transition to socialism.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Paulo, and thank you, Patrick, for the interpreting. So now we will invite Professor Radhika DESAI, who's from the University of Manitoba, to talk to us. She is a professor at the Department of Political Studies and also director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group of the University of Manitoba. She is the author of Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization and Empire, and also Intellectuals and Socialism, Social Democrats and the Labour Party, as well as Revitalizing Marxist Theory for Today's Capitalism and Developmental and Cultural Nationalisms. So Radhika, please.
Thank you very much, Kinchi. And I just wanted to say that I've just put up here the details of the Chinese translation of Geopolitical Economy. It was translated in several languages, including German, Russian, Chinese, Turkish, and so on. So anyway, for those who are interested, because much of what I've got to say actually comes from that book, and it covers a lot of the themes that we have discussed. What is the phase of capitalism we are at today? What is the new Cold War, etc., etc. And the fundamental premise from which I'm operating is that trying to understand the world economy in what I call cosmopolitan terms, which is to say terms that suppose that the whole world economy is a single seamless whole, whose division into a multitude of different countries doesn't matter, is wrong. So paradigms like globalization, empire, etc. are very problematic. So anyway, I just wanted to make a few general remarks. So first of all, perhaps I will begin with the most fundamental, perhaps, and the one that we are most concerned with here today, which is really, or the set of issues. So I really feel that we are at the moment in the most serious crisis that capitalism has ever seen. And it's quite possible that we may be looking at essentially its end in some fashion. Whether we turn to socialism or not is another question altogether. I've also been doing a lot of writing on this theme, which is available on the Canadian Dimension magazine website. And the reason for that, it connects up with what Professor Wen, Michael, and several other people have been saying, which is that we're really looking at a point in time when the financialization of the world economy, or financialization particularly led by the United States and the United Kingdom, has been bearing down on the economy of the productive economy of the capitalist world in a completely unsustainable fashion. So that we're now at a point where the burden of financialization, of debt, etc., had already, in a sense, brought the productive economy of the world to the point last year when people were predicting a really, really serious knockdown, depression, and in a certain sense, the pandemic has simply accelerated it. Now, in this context, I also wanted to bring up Professor Wen's ideas about the new Cold War. I think the new Cold War against China, the new Cold War against Russia, the original Cold War, all of these things, we give them special names as though they are isolated events. In reality, they are part of the systematic dynamic of international relations in the capitalist world. So from the beginnings of capitalism, there is a certain dialectic that has characterized relations between countries. What Marx, in his very important remarks on Henry Carey at the end of the Grundrisse, called the relations of producing nations. So how have producing nations related to one another? At one level, the issue is very simple. Essentially, dominant nations have sought to exercise their dominion over the rest of the country, of the world, essentially, in order that they may externalize their contradictions. Because capitalism is contradictory, it is imperialist, and the purpose of imperialism is to be able to externalize the consequences of your contradictions, excess commodities, excess capital, etc., etc. So this dialectic has been working. In this context, some countries, beginning with Germany, the United States, Japan, and coming up to all the way to China today, some countries have resisted this domination. And so this dialectic of imperialist domination and resistance to that has always characterized the relations of capitalism. And the Cold War was really one chapter in a much longer story, as is the new Cold War against China. So that's the second most important thing. Now, specifically in relation to financialization, the role of the dollar, etc., I just like to say a couple of things. First of all, there's a lot of misunderstanding around finance and money simply because neoclassical economics fails to understand money. It simply assumes that money is a sort of veil over real economic transactions. And I also want to reinforce another point that Michael made in a very big way. There is a lot of really interesting thinking in China that is going on. However, in China, bulk of the economics education simply reinforces the neoclassical paradigm. And in that situation, you are going to be raising entire generations of students who are systematically unable to understand what their own economy is getting right and what the capitalist world is getting wrong. So I think that this needs to be corrected in a massive fashion. Financialization. I just want to make one small correction, I would like to think, or at least one small appendix in a certain sense to what Michael was saying. Michael said that we have been looking at financialization really for 100 years. I would say that it's more interesting, as I think Professor Wen was suggesting, to date it at roughly the 1970s, because I agree completely with Michael, and I've used his work and I've further elaborated on it, and we are further going to develop it in this book we are writing. It's true that Marx, Mill, Hilferding, I've got a long article on Hilferding, they all expected that capitalism would become monopoly and finance capital, and it would essentially develop into socialism. And in a certain sense, what happened in the 3 decades after the Second World War was precisely in a partial fulfillment of these expectations, because capitalism was tamed, it was harnessed to providing a better life for working people, etc., etc., partly because of the demonstration effect of the Soviet Union and of course later China and so on. And it's only when this model got into trouble, and it got into trouble because its fundamental character as capitalism was not abolished. So at some point, this model was in trouble. And at that point, from the 1970s onwards, which coincides with the dollar going off gold, etc., that is roughly when the trend towards financialization occurred, simply because there was an overall stagnation in the world economy. So the period from the 50s to the 70s had in fact been a period of relatively robust, productive growth within the capitalist world, and partly it was so because it was a highly regulated form of capitalism, not free market capitalism, which to my mind tends towards stagnation. So anyway, so the dating of when financialization begins should be from roughly the 1970s. And a related point I'd like to make, which again perhaps reinforces what both Professor Ben and Michael were saying, is that the trend towards financialization occurs in good part. Of course, there are many causes, but a very fundamental cause is the fact that the capitalist world is now in stagnation. Productive investment is not attractive. So what overtakes productive investment is investment, which is really a wrong word to use for financial investment, but investment in financial markets and essentially financial forms of investment, what Marx would have called M' forms of or M' circuits of capital, which do not produce anything. And so since that, so that's one mechanism. The second mechanism has everything to do with the dollar's world role. And this is what I also show in my book, Geopolitical Economy. So the geopolitical economy is really a questioning of the idea that the UK was once hegemonic or, you know, supplied the world with money and then the Americans did, etc. What I show is that the UK situation actually rested on the empire. Britain provided the world with liquidity because Britain had an empire. It could extract colonial surpluses from colonies like India, colonies in the Caribbean, and so on. And then it could export capital in this form to the rest of the world. As long as Britain had an empire, this arrangement could work. The moment, however, that it no longer had an empire, Britain could not provide the world with liquidity. America never had an empire. So my argument in geopolitical economy is that despite the United States huffing and puffing and doing everything in its power to make the dollar the world's money, to leave the world with no alternative to the dollar as the world's money, in fact, the dollar has never functioned properly as the world money. So the problems of 1971 occurred, and thereafter what has happened is that the United States has sought to deal with the contradictions of the dollar as the world's money, which was essentially you printed money, you offered, it was subject to the Tiejun dilemma. The more deficits you created and supplied the world with liquidity with, the greater the downward pressure on the dollar. What the United States did at this point is it supplied the world, it counteracted the Tiejun dilemma essentially by creating an artificial demand for dollars in the financial world. So for example, Professor Wen was talking about the GDP of America and finance and so on. The fact of the matter is that, the proportion of US dollar in international transactions, of course, the proportion of the US dollar in international transactions is very high because so much of the volume of economic, international transactions is actually financial. It is about, not about buying goods, not buying wheat or oil or cotton or anything. It's about buying financial assets whose value is, of course, very enormous. So that exaggerates the role of the US dollar, and that is why the One Belt, One Road initiative, the various forms of dollarization, de-dollarization in terms of countries agreeing to trade with each other in each other's currencies and so on. That is why these measures are working, because most of the dollar's world role, which looks very big in these statistics, is actually simply financial transactions, which is a zero-sum game, and the whole world is not participating in it. One of the things I love to point out is that people like to call the 2008 crisis the global financial crisis. There was nothing global about the financial crisis. It was what I would call the North Atlantic financial crisis. That is to say, it affected chiefly the United States and those economies who had invested in the toxic securities generated by the financial machine of the United States. And chief among those economies were the Eurozone economies and the UK, and they were the ones who suffered the most. Practically everybody else got a short, sharp trade shock, and then they got up, they dusted themselves off and continued growing for many years thereafter. So this is the key one has to understand, that the financialization, we also talk about it as though it affects the whole world. Actually, different countries have participated very differently in financialization. China was not affected because, as Professor Wen says, China has participated in the bond market. It did not participate in the market for the toxic securities generated by the American financial system. So that's another point that I would just like to make. And I think that what we are looking at right now, this new Cold War, which Professor Wen against China, which Professor Wen analyzed so well, and I think he's substantially right about this. What this new Cold War against China actually represents is in fact the debility of neoliberal capitalism itself, and therefore its inability to act as a base for countries like America that want to exert their dominion over the rest of the world. Because in addition to the new Cold War, what we are also witnessing is the inability of America anymore to influence world events, whether it is in Libya or Syria, or even well, obviously in East Asia, where of course China's influence is not easily counteracted. What we are looking at is the recession of American influence. And this recession should also be seen in a much broader historical perspective. That is to say, if you think about it, and that's where Michael's pointing to the First World War as a very important turning point is very important, because what you see in 1914 is the peak of imperialism. This is about as far as it's going to go. Thereafter, and it's, and I actually like Arno Mayer's expression, the 30 Years' War, because I like to see the entire period from 1914 to 1945 as a single crisis period, including the two wars, including the Great Depression, and all of these are very linked with one another. So this long crisis period essentially is essentially bounded very tellingly by the Russian and the Chinese revolutions. It is bookended by those. And these revolutions also mark the very important reduction in the power of the imperialist countries, of course, combined with decolonization. And this recession in the power of these countries has continued. And today it has reached a point where not only does the West have formidable rivals like China, but precisely because of the debility of their model of capitalism, the unity of the West is itself breaking down. And that's why the Europeans, for example, are going to have to respond very differently than the Americans to what's going on. The Americans are, as I think several people have pointed out, have been in denial about all this, and they continue to try to project this idea that they are dominant, etc. But this is not going to work. So those were some of the main points I wanted to make. Yeah, so I think I will end there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radhika. So now can I invite Michael, Professor HUDSON, to say maybe 10 minutes?
But finance capitalism seeks to reverse and resist socialist trends of industrial capitalism, to roll back the history of feudalism, and to throw all of the external costs that do not make money for the financial sector onto the economy, global warming, and all of the cleanup costs. So a socialist economy of the future and a socialist globalization would focus on what today's mainstream economics excludes from its value and cost functions: the environment, health, to which Professor Wen pointed, and also to human fulfillment, art, and culture. These simply do not appear in the private sector balance sheets. They're considered without value. I think Marx pointed out how when people get sick and they pay the doctors more, that actually adds to GDP, to gross domestic product, because it costs more. And Marx made fun of counting the cleanup costs as part of output when it actually was a part of overhead. I like Professor Wen's comment. Let me just get back. Comment that the more modernized an institution, the more costly it is. The US economy has become the world's highest cost economy because finance increases the cost of living. Finance increases the cost of housing. Finance takes for itself what really should be the public revenue, the public tax collection of land rent and natural resources rent. Finance builds rentier charges and economic rent into the cost of living and doing business. And these costs are unearned income, special privilege, exactly what industrial capitalism was supposed to free economies from. So the role of socialism and socialist globalization should be to put society back together and to heal what finance capitalism is pulled apart in the process of carving out rent-yielding opportunities. And of course, the main public utility that's privatized is banking and finance. And that's why Professor Wen noted that it is the hegemony's desperate effort to sustain its privilege to transfer the cost of debt crisis to the world, while the United States creates numbers in a balance sheet out of nothing. The United States has become the main rentier economy, living off the rest of the world, not providing it. I don't think there's much understanding of that in the West. The earlier Professor Silver pointed to the Black Lives Matter, but this is a very not a class-conscious movement. Black Lives Matter is not about Black wages. It's not about Black home ownership. It's not about Black disease and health. it's only about police brutality against blacks. It's not about police brutality against workers. It's not against police brutality to break up labor unions, to break up social protests. The Black Lives Matter movement has been co-opted by the most reactionary forces in our society, the Democratic Party. It's trying to be co-opted into an anti-Trump movement to bring back the Democratic Party under Joe Biden, which will be finance capitalism on steroids, with an exclamation point, a very reactionary form of finance capitalism. There's no class consciousness in this whatsoever. The Black Lives Matter movement is an antithesis to class consciousness. And the Democratic Party's attempt to break society into ethnic and sexual units, ethnic, social identity, every kind of identity except that of wage earners, except an economic identity. So we should see this as reactionary right-wing movement. Now, Radhika returned to my own main theme in pointing out that finance capitalism is not sustainable. She's right, it's self-devouring. This is the essential dynamic of finance capital, with its exponential doubling and redoubling of interest that attaches debt to the economy's real estate, industry, and infrastructure, and above all to other financial capital. Most financial claims are on other financial institutions because that's where the money is now. Finance ends up exploiting finance. Once it's exploited and drained the industrial economy, once it's exploited and drained real estate, capital, and labor, all it can exploit is the state, the public sector, and the rest of the financial sector. So Professor Wen and Radhika are both right that the big change occurred really in 1980 when with Thatcher, Reagan, the tax cuts and the shift of taxation off of finance capital onto industry and onto labor. We're dealing now with a purely parasitic form of capitalism that is just the reverse of what industrial capitalism promised to be 150 years ago.
Well, thank you very much. Now, Professor Wen.
Many thanks to all the discussants. I see that one point we have meet together, that is the background. All people understand that economically speaking, the most important issue comes from the background, that is capitalism has upgraded into the financial capitalism. The financial capitalism is different with the industrial capitalism. It's a financial capital is an independent power. Many benefits, very little percentage of the rich population. So 99% marginalized, not only in the United States, but also in the world. But I would like to mention one thing is essentially different. The financial capital in China now still be a part of the state control in name of the state ownership, originally in name of the whole people ownership. And the whole people ownership is socialism, and the state ownership is a semi-socialism. So even that we think that financial capital competition in the world is the economic background of the new Cold War, but we still need to know the essential difference. So but in the United States, everybody knows that the financial power belongs to the private bank, belong to these bankers. So Federal Reserve is a private bankers organized a kind of institute. Then these private banker make decision, and then the governments carry it out. So that is why this new Cold War initiated by the private bank system, that they only want to maintain their private interest and then transfer out big cost to the whole world. So that is the essential problem. So, but this time, I think that just like last time's financial crisis taking place into Wall Street, now this time, the financial bubble even more larger, doubled than before. It's because of last month, and just you know, within 1 month, they issued more than 14 to 15 trillion dollars. That is the biggest in the history. So that means that large number of this bubble currency flow just like a flood to flooding the whole world. That is the problem, because that originally they issued this paper currency to buy the American, not only the government bonds, but also the company bonds. And it means that in one's hands, that is this transnational company, they created a lot of bad loan. But on another side, they created more bad money to buy such kind of loan. So that is it's a play game. This game is stupid. Very obviously to show that the financial transnational capital used their power to flood the whole world by their the bubble currency and bubble debts. So that is going to the end. Nobody think that these debts still can have the value. Nobody think that this currency is a kind of currency. So nowadays, the indicator of American dollar decreased, and then the debts also decreased. So they want to set up a kind of Roosevelt New Deal. It's a Trump version Roosevelt New Deal. They want to turn this big financial capital, and especially the debt capital, into the infrastructure construction. That is the right way, but it's too late. And also think about when China used the Roosevelt New Deal since the 1998 until now, China has done 22 years invest into the infrastructure construction by the state debts and also by state bank. So that is similar as a Roosevelt New Deal in 1930s. But now Trump wants to do that similar as a Roosevelt New Deal in 1930s, but he doesn't have the tools, doesn't have the measure, because these are measures controlled by the private sector, not controlled by the state. So when Roosevelt started his New Deal, he stopped the private bank. So that is the difference. So when we talk about this new Cold War, when we focus on the background, I think that we may also do the further analysis about the basic difference between United States and China. So that is, I think that my feedback to this discussion. I hope that we can deepen our discussion and after this forum, because just today, the United States have a new policy, try to delinking Hong Kong dollar to American dollar system. Originally, I mean, when I said that we have predicted such kind of new events, that is half a year ago when we have a discussion in Macau. I said that the Hong Kong is the financial center for mainland China to take the foreign capital 70% from Hong Kong. Now, by American new measure, and Hong Kong will lose the financial center position. When Hong Kong loses the position, Singapore will take place. But it's not the same position. Anyway, when we observe the trade war and then high-tech war and the financial war started, so delinking Hong Kong from American dollar system is just the first measure, and then you can see the second and then third. So just let's see what happened. We will have more events to do the analysis. Thank you.